Today we are going to be subtracting integers. And so when we're subtracting integers, we're going to be talking about this concept of opposites. And so let's take a look at what opposites represent. The opposite of a number is the same number, but the opposite sign. So either a plus sign or a minus sign. So for instance, if I had the number 5, the opposite would end up being the number exactly the same distance from 0, but on the other side of the number line, it'd be -5. And so we talked about that concept earlier in this lesson, or this chapter, but here we're going to be dealing with this concept in subtraction. So let's take a look at this concept. The opposite of 6 is, well, there's a way to write that, and the way you're going to end up seeing it is this, the opposite. So this minus sign we can treat as the opposite. The opposite of 6. Well, the opposite of 6 is -6. And so that's the symbol. That's the symbol that you're going to end up seeing for the opposite, is this minus sign and then parentheses around some sort of number. Let's take a look at this next one. The opposite of -7 is, well, the opposite of -7, we could write that as the opposite of -7. So notice that this minus sign can be represented as the opposite of. The opposite of -7 is 7. Well, let's take a look at one other concept. So when we have a positive number, the opposite is a negative. When we have a negative number, the opposite is a positive. Well, the other type of number is 0. Well, notice on a number line, 0's in the center here. We've got 1 over on this side, -1 over on this side. 0 is neither positive or negative. It's a starting point. And so the opposite of 0 is 0 itself. And so 0 has no opposite. It's just itself. So what we're going to do first is use a number line to do some subtraction, to find the difference of some numbers. And so we'll start with this -6. So this is the starting point. This is the number that we start at. So we start here at -6. So let's go to -6. And let's read this. This is the opposite of -3. Well, what's the opposite of -3? The opposite is a +3. So let's say we start at -6, but we're going to take the opposite of -3, which is +3. So remember up here, the opposite of -7 is +7. So now I've changed the problem into an addition problem. So now I'm going to add 3. So taking away negatives is the same thing as adding positives. So I'm going to go in the positive direction, 1, 2, 3 spaces. So what's that number? It's -3. So the answer is -3. Let's take a look at the next one. Here we have a -1 take away 5. So let's start at -1 because that's our starting point. So we go over to -1, put the dot there, and now this is take away 5, or the opposite of 5. What's the opposite of 5? Well, that's the same thing as -1 plus -5. So remember, the opposite of 6 was -6. So the opposite of 5 is -5. So if I'm taking 5 away, I'm going to add -5. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I start at -1, I take 5 away, I end up at -6, and that is our answer. Take a look at the next one. Again, I'm starting at the first number, so I start at 5, so I go over to 5, and now I'm taking away negatives. Well, what is the opposite of a negative? That's what it's saying. 5, and then I need to take the opposite of negatives. So the opposite of negatives is a positive. It's the same thing as adding 1, so I'm just going in the positive direction, 1 space. So 6 is the answer. So we're going to use that rule when we're doing these problems. And so every time I want you to think of that minus sign as the opposite of this number. And we'll change it to an addition problem. So we're going to start at -6. So that number never changes. Remember, we always start at that number. And then from there we take it the opposite. So the opposite of 4. So again, this is like the opposite of 4, which is plus -4. So that makes -10. The same sign means we're going to end up adding those two numbers together. And so over here, we have -7 take away -12. Well, let's start at -7, And then let's do the opposite of negative 12. Opposite is positive 12. So we're adding positive. Now, when they're opposite signs, we end up subtracting those two numbers. So we end up at 5. And is it positive or negative? Well, there's more positives than negatives, so it becomes a positive 5. Over here, same sort of thing. We're going to start at 12, and then we are going to take the opposite of 16. Well, the opposite of 16 is negative 16. So now we see it's just an addition problem. And opposite signs mean we're going to subtract. Now, why is it negative 4, not positive 4? Because there's more negatives than positives. Notice that the number negative 16, this is the number that's further from 0, so it determines the sign. Well, here we start at 5, so we bring that down, and then we take the opposite of negatives. What's the opposite of negative 19? It's a positive 19. So now we've got the same sign, so we're going to end up adding those two numbers, and we end up at 24. Taking a look at our next one. Again, we're starting at the first number. We always start there, just like we did on the number line. We always start at the first number, but then we take the opposite of negatives. The opposite of negatives is positives, so we're going to end up adding 18. But when I add 18 to negative 18, I end up subtracting because they're opposite in sign, and I end up at 0. Again, we start at 23 because that's the first number, but then we're taking the opposite of negatives. Opposite of negatives is positives, so I end up having to add 23. When I add 23 to 23, I end up at 46. The next one here, we start at negative 10, so that's the number we're going to start at, negative 10. And then I'm taking the opposite of negatives. Well, the opposite of negatives, those are positives, so I end up adding 9. And so I'm starting at negative 10, adding 9, that puts me at negative 1. Notice that I had more negatives than positives, so I end up having a negative number instead of a positive. And opposite signs mean you subtract. So you always start at the first number, whatever number that is. I'm starting at 29, and then I've got the opposite of negative 13. The opposite of negative 13 is positive 13. So when I add those two numbers together, I get 42. And that is our answer. So those are the types of problems that you're going to see on tonight's homework. Good luck.